fishing is the only hobby that I have that I really enjoy that I'm terrible at. I've been fishing since I was a kid. I keep a tackle box in the trunk of my car just in case the opportunity arises to cast my bait in some pond somewhere. When I was a pastor, I fished most of all. And even then, the best I could ever do was to occasionally land a pretty good-sized bass or a nice, maybe edible brim. On the sea, the salt water that is, I'm even worse. I think the only thing I've ever caught in the ocean other than a pinfish is a flounder that just barely made it over the regulation to bring home and eat. And how I did gloat over that meal in front of all of my friends. I actually own a book entitled Fishing for Dummies. And I know it by heart. And it never does me any good. That's the kind of fisherman that I am. I can fish and fish and fish and come home with nothing, or come home with tiny little fish to show my kids, and that's about it. Incidentally, I'm in good company because the disciples never catch anything, you may have noticed in the Gospels, without Jesus either on the boat with them or nearby. I tried that too, praying to Jesus. That doesn't work either. But I know that feeling of emptiness that these disciples must have felt. After fishing all night, and any of you who are fishermen in here know the same kind of feeling. Maybe you went out on a charter boat and came back with nothing, or you fished all night and you went through all your nabs and all your beer, because that's the only time Baptists drink is when they're fishing. And you came home empty-handed. Just a kind of an empty feeling, like you wasted your time in a way. Your ego's bruised, and then some stranger on the coastline, and they're not far from the coast, they're making their way back in, yells out to them, "Boys, you don't have any fish, do you?" I like the King James Version best. "Have ye any meat?" That would have made the Burger King commercial better, wouldn't it? "Have ye any beef?" And you know they were just gritting their teeth to tell that stranger, "No, empty-handed." And so the stranger says, "Cast your net on the right side." And so you can hear them, just about hear them, talking to themselves after they'd been out all night. And some stranger on the coastline says, "Cast your net on the right side." Now, what do you think they were thinking? All right, well, cast it on the right side then. He says, "Cast it on the right side, Mr. Smarty Pants." Well, how many sides do you think we've cast on? We've been out here all night. Tell how frustrated they were. Peter's not even wearing any clothes anymore. It was a long night. And here this stranger says, kind of mocks them a little bit. "You're empty-handed. Well, why don't you try a new idea? Cast your net on the right side of the boat." But here's my question for all of us for today, and the question I've been chewing on all week. Why did he say, "Cast your net on the right side"? How did he know that they hadn't already fished from the right side? Text doesn't say. Text doesn't say they were fishing on the left side and for them to switch the net to the right side. He doesn't say cast your net on the other side. He's very specific about this. Cast your net on the right side. Strange. They were expert fishermen. You think that by now they'd have fished all the sides, the left, the right, from the stern, from the bow. These guys knew what they were doing. They fished all the time. This was their profession. They knew how to fish from whatever side. They probably had sonar. That didn't work either. In this time in nautical history, we should all know, there were no centerline rudders on boats. Now you look at a boat, you look down behind the stern, you see that rudder right there in the middle, attached to an engine. Or if it's on a great cruise liner, you just see the propeller and then the rudders behind the propeller to guide it in the right direction. And it's controlled by a mechanism, somehow, a steering wheel somewhere up on the deck. Well, not so back then. Back then, they had the steering mechanism on the right side of the boat. And it would have been a kind of steering oar attached to the stern, which is the back wall of the boat. So the right side of the boat is the steering side. And that's where we get the word starboard from. If you've ever been on a boat and you heard a captain say starboard, that's the right side. It's always the right side. The steering side. That's also where we get the word port for the left side, because a boat would always port or dock on its left side so as not to disrupt the steering mechanism on the right side. So we all clear? Port side is left. Starboard, the right side, is the steering side. So when Jesus, to them is a stranger, says, cast your net on the right side, he might as well be telling them, cast your net on the incorrect side. Cast your net on the wrong side. Because they knew that if they cast their net on the right side, on the steering side, the net could get caught up in that steering mechanism and frustrate their net or cut it open or fray it. So you fish from the left side. You cast your net from the left side and you trawl it that way. And if you wanted to get to some school of fish over on your right side, you'd steer around and cast your net still on the left side. But Jesus doesn't say turn around. He just says cast your net on the right side. The incorrect side, the inappropriate side. Or for today, we'll just call it the unconventional side. Now, if you're as good a fisherman as I am, well, you know all the wrong places to cast your hook. And I'm always trying to outsmart fish, and that should tell you something about my smarts. But one of my strategies, which never works, is that I like to cast my hook into those little shadowy places where there might be some kind of submerged branch or something, a log or a tree branch dipping into the water, somewhere that I think fish might like to hide. Because that's what my Fishing for Dummies book said to do. Think like a fish. So I try to throw my hook and my bait over in those little areas, and it always gets stuck. And I always reel it in, and I end up spending the rest of the day in my tackle box. That's the story of every time I go fishing. And that's exactly, I bet, what the disciples are thinking right now. When we cast our net on the steering side, it's going to get stuck. Something's going to happen. And even if we catch all these fish, they're all going to fall out of the net. It's the wrong side. But having fished all night and so frustrated and so empty-handed, they oblige the stranger and they cast it over the right side. And when they do, the nets begin to sag and become heavy with fish. So many fish that they can hardly hoist the net back onto the boat. The gospel is always about casting to the right side, which in this case is the wrong side, the counterintuitive side, the unconventional side, the side you don't think of normally. We've never done it that way before, Pastor. How many times have you heard that phrase in a church meeting? Well, we've never done it that way before. Jesus asks us, well, do you have any meat? Cast it on the right side. In the parable of the sower, which we find in every gospel except this one, the sower, Jesus says, goes out to sow. And he has his bag of seed, and he's casting the seed. And the seed, Jesus says, lands on the path. Other seed lands on rocky ground, you may remember. Still other seed falls amongst the thorns. And then finally, some seed falls into some good soil. Now, I may be a bad fisherman, but I'm not so bad a farmer as to know that whoever this sower is might like to check out the New York Times best-selling book, Farming for Dummies. This has got to be the worst sowing job I've ever heard of. And everyone listening to this parable who lived in an agricultural society would have thought that this sower was a little bit unconventional, to put it mildly, to put it nicely. He's just throwing seed everywhere. Well, seed's expensive. It's delicate. You've got to place it just right there in the good soil and be thoughtful about it. That's not what the kingdom of God is like, Jesus says. The sower goes out to sow, and he's just flinging seed everywhere. Unconventional, strange, foolish. I'd say the most conventional way to describe the church today in America is to say that the church is fading, that the church is dying, and that the best thing that we can all do is to stand up straight and walk with dignity down this fading path until we meet Jesus on the last day, just the few of us that are left. And I just refuse to believe it that way. Yes, there are many churches that are dying. There are many churches that are selling their property and giving themselves up, and the sanctuary ends up being a coffee shop or some kind of music hall or theater. And there are some churches that are dying that don't deserve to die. There are other churches that are dying that do deserve to die for making God look bad, or even worse, making God boring. But I believe that Hauerwas, the theologian at Duke, is also right, that churches have been giving atheists less and less in which to disbelieve. But I also believe that there is an unconventional way to describe the church. And that is to say that it is going through renewal. And the dead weight is being slawed off, and we're being pared down to a lean, mean skeleton crew that is really about the business of the gospel. It doesn't take that many people to catch a lot of fish. Churches are reinventing themselves. Churches of all sizes, large and small, are finding ways to cast their net on the right side of the boat and surprising themselves. There's a church not far from here named Oakmont Baptist Church. It's in Greenville, North Carolina. The pastor, Greg Rogers, and he and his staff were alerted at one point that they were going to have some property come available on their lot, or just adjacent to their lot. It was a large, low-income housing project. And did they want to buy it? And they thought over it for a little while, and they felt like it might be the right thing to do just to get that property and have it. And so they bought the property, and then they deliberated some more and started figuring out they had two options. One, they could raise the property to the ground and just have that lot, or they could keep it and do ministry there. And they did the latter. They bought that property, and they turned that low-income housing project into their own missionary project. And they began to meet the people there and to befriend them. And they began to do ministry there. And they started a college ministry. And they offered low-income housing to the working poor. They ended up building a community center there from the prophets. They poured everything into this place. And eventually, the pastor said, it is an amazing number of people in our church doing at least one kind of ministry, and we're all engaged, and we know these people's names. And then he said, how blind I was, and how my radar was not aware of the needs around me. He said, this new ministry has deepened my faith. It has allowed me to reinvent myself and myself as a minister. And he said, I think our church has reinvented itself. Even in little old Mount Gilead, where I was pastor, we didn't have hardly any resources at all. But we did see across the street an elementary school where over 90% of the children were on free and reduced lunch. And many of the children would go home at the end of the day hungry and alone. They'd find themselves at home, nobody there. Their parents would still be at work or out somewhere else. God only knows. We started a Wednesday afternoon program, and the children started coming, and soon enough, we had over 20, 25 kids coming in our fellowship hall every Wednesday. And at first, we were just doing arts and crafts and telling missions and telling stories and teaching them how to sing songs and sing hymns. And then all of a sudden, we had discipleship Bible studies going. And then we started picking them up on Sunday morning and bringing them to church. And then some of them confessed faith and were baptized. I do recall just a few weeks ago here in Warrenton, Palm Sunday, and we had the covered dish luncheon. And I'm not accustomed to your customs. And so when I got down to that luncheon, that fellowship hall was packed. It was beautiful. But I did make a mental note that there were more people at the luncheon than there were in worship. And I thought to myself, you know, this little town is teeming with life that maybe you're not going to catch by tossing your net over the left side of the boat. We know from Scripture that Jesus, when he ascended to the Father, sat at the Father's right hand. Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father. Martin Luther said that just means he's everywhere now. I'd like to say it means Jesus could be anywhere he said he would be. And where did Jesus say he would be? He said, you'll find me with the poor. You'll find me with those who weep. You'll find me with those who've been shut out, with the thirsty, the hungry, the naked, the stranger, the prisoner. And all those faces, you'll see my face. It's interesting. The disciples didn't notice Jesus' face until the nets began to sag and pull that boat downward on its right side. And you know what the best news of all is? Is when they lugged that net in for breakfast. The net didn't break. they didn't lose one